Alrighty. Just finish all the posting, so I think we're gonna get started. Hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads. Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. I don't know why it doesn't go clear. Maybe I need a higher resolution camera or something, or maybe it's just because like the nature of small text or something. But today we're just gonna do one story for today. It's not gonna be that long a stream, but I mean, to be fair, the Wife of Bath's tale is, including the like banter between her and the other like pilgrims, is there's a lot of text to go through, so we're gonna just do that today. Only the Wife of Bath's tale today, and yeah, that's the plan. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day, and we're just gonna get started right away. Reading, I can't talk. Reading the Wife of Bath's tale. But of course we have our prologue. Were there no books at all on the subject, my own experience gives me a perfect right to talk of the sorrows of marriage. For ladies and gentlemen, since I was 12 years old, the living God be thanked, I married 5 husbands in church. If it be allowable for me to wed so often, each of them a man of standing in his own sphere. Now to be sure, not long ago, I was told that as Christ went by once to a wedding, at Cana in Galilee, he showed me by that same precedent I was not to be married more than once. Also I was to bear in mind the sharp words that Jesus, God and man, spoke beside a well when he reproved the woman of Samaria. Thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom now thou hast is not thy husband. That's what he said, to be sure. But what he meant by that, I cannot tell. All I ask is, why wasn't the 5th man the Samaritan's husband? How many could she have in marriage? In all my life, I've never heard a definition of the number. People can surmise and interpret right and left. All I know for certain is that God expressly and interpret right and left. Sorry. I reread that line. All I know for certain is God expressly command us to increase and multiply. An excellent text which I can understand well enough. Mading Ching. And I know very well that he said my husband should leave father and mother and cleave to me. But he made no mention of number, of bigamy or octogamy. So why should people talk as if it were a disgrace? Basically, the Wife of Bath is justifying, polyamory, basically. Take that wise king, King Solomon. I bet he had more wives than one. I wish to God it were lawful for me to be solaced half as often. What a heavenly gift he must have had for all of his wives. Yeah, but if you remember my reading of the book of 2 Kings, it was not a good thing that Solomon had all those wives. No man alive has anything like it. So far as I can make out, Lord knows this noble king had many a merry bout with each on the first night. I mean, you date a girl and say see in 3 years. So full of life was he. Blessed be God that I have married 5. I rummaged out the best they had from the bottoms of their purses and strong boxes. Just as different schools make the scholar perfect, the different jobs are bound to make perfect the workman. I have been trained by 5 husbands. And welcome be the 6th whenever he comes. The truth is, I don't want to keep chaste forever. As soon as my husband departs this world, some other Christian shall marry me. For then, says the apostle, I am free to wed in God's name where I please. He says it's no sin to be married. It is better to marry than to burn. What do I care if people rail at the villainous Lamech and his bigamy? All I know is that Abraham was a holy man, and Jacob too, so far as I can tell. And both of them, like many other holy men, had more than 2 wives. Can you tell me where Almighty God has at any time expressly prohibited marriage? Kindly answer me that. Where has he commanded virginity? No question, you know as well as I do, that when the Apostle Paul spoke of virginity, he said he had no precept for it. A woman may be advised to stay single, but advice is not a command. That's not wrong. He left it to our own judgment, for had God commanded virginity, by doing so he would have condemned marriage. And surely, if seed were never sown, where would virginity come from? At any rate, Paul dared not command a thing for which his master gave no behest. There's a prize going for virginity. Let him win it who can. We'll see who'll make the running. But this call is not for everyone. Only where God, of his power, chooses to bestow it. All I know is the apostle was a virgin, and though he said he wished all men were even as himself, all that's only exhortation to virginity, and he allowed me to become a wife by way of concession. So, if my husband should die, it's no sin to marry me, not even bigamy. Yet it were good for a man not to touch a woman, the same meant in his bed or couch, for it's risky to bring fire and tow together. You'll understand the metaphor. Well, by and large, he held that virginity was better than marriage, because flesh is frail. Frail, I call it, unless the two mean to live in continence all their married lives. I grant all this. I don't begrudge that virginity should be preferred to bigamy. It pleases some to keep themselves pure in body and soul. Of my own case, I won't boast. Now, as you know, the master of a household doesn't have all of his utensils made of gold. Some are of wood, yet do him good service. God calls folk to him in different ways, and each has his own peculiar gift from God. Some one thing and some another, just as it pleases him to assign them. Virginity is a great perfection, and so is devout married chastity. But Christ, the wellspring of perfection, didn't tell everybody he ought to go and sell all that he had and give it to the poor, and so follow in his footsteps. He spoke to those who wished to live a life of perfection. And, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen, I am not one of them. I mean, to bestow the best years of my life on the acts and rewards of marriage? And tell me, to what end were organs and generations made? And what was a man made for? You can be sure they weren't made for nothing. Twist it as you like, argue back and forth, to prove they were made for the discharge of urine. That our little differences are there to tell male from female, and for no other reason. Did somebody say no? Experience teaches us the contrary. And so as not to vex the scholars, I'll say this. They were made for both purposes. That's to say, for use and pleasure of generation, wherein we do not displease God. Why else should it have been laid down in books that a man must pay his wife her due? And what would he make his payment if he didn't use his wretched instrument? Ba-dung-ching. You know what she's talking about. It follows they were given to all creatures for procreation as much as for the discharge of urine. But I'm not saying that everyone with that sort of equipment I spoke of is meant to go out and use it in the act of generation. In that case, no one would bother about chastity. Christ, like many a saint, since the beginning of the world, was a virgin and formed like a man. Yet they always lived in perfect chastity. I've nothing against virginity. Let virgins be loaves of the finest wheat flour, and call his wives barley bead. And yet, as St. Mark can tell you, it was the white barley bead that our Lord Jesus refreshed thousands. I'll persevere in the state of which God has called me. I am not particular. As a wife, I'll use my instrument as generously as my Maker gave it. If I be grudging, the Lord punish me. My husband shall have it night and morning, whenever he wants to come and pay his dues. I shan't stop him. A husband I must have, one that is both my debtor and my slave. And so long as I'm his wife, he'll have his tribulation of the flesh. While I'm alive, I'm given the power of his own body, and not he. That's what the Apostle Paul told me, and he bade our husbands love us well. I entirely approve of this view. Now up leapt the pardoner. Well, madam, said he, by God and St. John, you make a splendid preacher on this topic. Alas, I was just about to wed a wife, but why should my body pay such a price? I'd rather never marry anyone at all. Just you wait, she retorted. My tale hasn't even begun. No, you'll drink from a different barrel before I've done, and it won't waste as good as ale. And when I've finished telling you about the tribulation of matrimony, in which I'm a lifelong expert, that's to say, I've been a scourge myself, then you can decide whether you want a taste of the barrel I'm going to broach. Now be very careful before you come too near it, for I'll tell you a dozen cautionary tales. Now those who won't be warned by others become a warning to others. Those are Ptolemy's very words, as you find you'll read his Almagest. Madam, said the pardoner, let me entreat you to be good enough to go on as you've begun. Tell your story and spare no man. Teach us young fellows your techniques. Very well then, since it seems to please you, she said. But I only hope that no one in this company will take offense if I say what comes into my head, for I only mean to amuse. Now, sirs, I'll get on with my story. May I never drink another drop of wine or ale, if I lie, but 3 of those husbands of mine were good, and 2 bad. The 3 good were rich and old, and could barely keep the contract that bound us. You know what I mean by that. I ain't saying she a gold digger, but she ain't messing with no broke somethings. Now so help me God, it makes me laugh whenever I think how unmercifully I made them work of nights, and I thought nothing of it. That I swear. They'd given me their land and treasure, so I didn't need to trouble myself further to win their love or show them respect. Heavens above, they loved me so much I set no value on it. A sensible woman only busies herself to please them, except for my own profit and amusement. My word, I worked them hard, many the night. I made them bawl. I don't suppose they'd have won the Dunmow Filch, like some. Yet I ruled them so well in my own way that each was perfectly happy. They were always ready to bring me pretty things from the fair. How glad they were when I spoke to them nicely, for God knows how viciously I scolded. Now listen, you wise wives who know what I'm talking about, and I'll tell you how well I managed. This is the way to talk to them and put them in the wrong. For there is no man who can lie and perjure half so boldly as a woman. I'm not speaking of clever wives, but when they make mistakes. A really clever wife who knows her business can make her husband believe that black is white, and bring in their own maid as witness to in support. But listen to the way I used to go on. Is this the best you can do, you old dotard? Why is my neighbor's wife so smart and gay? She's respected whenever she goes, while I've got to sit at home. I've no clothes fit to wear. And what are you doing in her house? Is she that pretty? Are you so amorous? What were you whispering to the maid? You old lecher, give it a rest. And whenever I have a harmless chat with a friend or walk over to his house for a bit of fun, you rage at me like a fiend. Home you come, drunk as an owl, and sit on your bench, lecturing and making monstrous accusations. You say it's a great misfortune to marry a poor woman because of the expense. But if she's rich and well connected, then you say it's torture you have to put up with her pride and disconsolate airs. Basically, non-stop gossip. Yeah, that's what we'll go with. That's putting it for daytime TV. Oh, you rascal, if she's beautiful, you say all the lecturers will be after her, and her chastity won't last a moment because she's assailed on every side. You tell me that some want us for our riches, some for our figures, and some for our beauty. While some desire a woman because she can dance or sing, or for her breeding and conversation, or for her slender arms and hands. And so, by your account, the devil takes the lot. A fortress besieged at all points can't hold out for long, so you say. And if she's ugly, then you say she wants every man she sets eyes on, and fawns on them like a spaniel, until she finds some man to do business with her. There's no goose on the lake so gray it would find its gander, says you. And then you say it's hard to control a girl no man would willingly keep. Miserable wretch, that's how you go on when you go to bed, muttering that no sane man need marry, nor any man who hopes for heaven. Thunder and lightning break your shriveling neck. Says you, a leaky roof, a smoky chimney, and a scolding wife drive a man out of his own home. Oh, bless us all! What ails the old man that he grumbles so? Now when you say we women are ready to hide our faults until the knot's safely tied, and then we show them, a blackguard's proverb if ever there was one. You tell me that oxen, asses, horses, and hounds can be tried out at leisure before you buy them. And so can basins, washing bowls, spoons, stools, and household goods. Besides pots and clothes and dresses. But no one tries out a wife until they're married, a wretched old dotard. And then, says you, we reveal our faults. Hey gauntlets, welcome to the stream. I hope you are doing well. Now you also say it vexes me if you aren't forever saying how pretty I am, gazing on my face and paying me compliments whenever we go. Or if you forget to make a fuss of me on my birthday. Or if you aren't polite to my nurse, my chambermaid, and my father's family and friends. That's what you say, you old barrel full of lies. You've even got a hold of a false suspicion of our apprentice, Jankin. I think that's how you say that. Or was it Yankin? I think it's Jankin. because of his curly golden hair, and the way he squires me wherever I go. I wouldn't have him if you died tomorrow. But tell me this, you wretch, why do you hide away the keys of the strong box from me? It's my property as well as yours, for goodness sake. Now what do you want? To make the mistress of the house look a fool? Now by St. James you can rave as you please, but you shan't have both my body and my goods. No matter what you do one or to the other, you must forego. And what's the use of all your snooping and spying? I sometimes think you want to keep me locked up in your strong box. What you ought to say is, dear wife, go where you like and have your fun. I won't listen to any tittle-tattle. Dame Alice, I know you're a true and faithful wife. We cannot love a man who keeps a check on our comings and goings, for we must be free. Blessed above all others be a wise philosopher, Master Ptolemy, for he has this proverb in his Almagest. Wisest of all is he who cares no whit who is richer than himself. From this proverb you should understand there's no call to fret how well off other people are when you've gotten enough for yourself. For you old dotard, don't worry. You'll have cunt enough tonight if you want it. Was there ever anyone so miserly as to refuse another man a light for his candle from his lantern? It won't make it any dimmer, for goodness sake. Why grumble if you've got enough? Then you say our chastity's in danger if we make ourselves gay with clothes and jewelry. And then, you brute, you've got to back yourself up with this text from St. Paul. Let women adorn themselves with modest apparel, with shamefastness and sobriety, and not with broided hair and fine jewelry or gold, or pearls or costly array. I'll take as much notice of your texts and rubrics as a flea. And once you said I was like a cat, because when you singe its skin, it stays at home. But when its coat is sleek and smart, it won't stay half a day in the house, but goes off first thing in the morning to show off its coat and go caterwauling after the toms. Which means, Sir Brute, that if I'm looking smart, it's because I want to run out and parade my miserable rags. Sir, old fool, what's the use of spying, even if you begged Argus with his 100 eyes to guard me as best as he can? I say to you, he wouldn't be able to keep me unless I wanted. I'd put it across him if it killed me. You also said there are 3 things that trouble the whole earth, and none can endure the 4th. Oh, sweet Saint Brute, Jesus shortened your life. Still, you preach away, saying an odious wife is reckoned one of these misfortunes. Aren't there any other comparisons to use in your parables without dragging in an innocent wife? Then you liken a woman's love to hell, to a barren waterless land, and to burning naphtha. The more it burns, the more eager it is to consume whatever will burn. Excuse me. That was a long, paragraph I had to read there, so. And the wife of Bath just goes on. It's why, once again, we're going to be spending quite a while with just her story. Okay. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. Then you liken a woman's love to hell, to a barren, waterless land, to burning naphtha. The more it burns, the more eager it is to consume water and burn. Just as worms destroy a tree, a woman destroys her husband. Everyone who is chained to a wife knows this, and that's what you say. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, that's how I've made my old husbands firmly believe they talked when they were drunk. It was all lies, but I got my niece, as well as Jenkins, to bear me out. Lord, the trouble and grief I gave them, and they quite innocent, by God's sweet passion. Like a horse I'd bite one moment, and whinny to be petted the next. I'd scold even when I was in the wrong, or I'd have been done for often as not. When you go to the mill to grind, it's first come, first serve. I'd get in first with my reproaches, and so put a stop to our strife. They were glad enough to find a quick excuse for things they'd never in their lives been guilty of. I'd accuse my husband of retching, when he was so ill he could hardly stand. Yet it tickled him to the heart, because he thought it showed how fond of him I was. When I walked abroad at night, I'd swear it was to spy out the girls he slept with, and that gave me cover for plenty of fun. Such mother wit is granted us at our birth. God has given lies, tears, and spinning by nature to all women while they live. So I can boast of one thing. In the end I got the better of my husbands in every way, whether by force, cunning, or one means and another, such as keeping up an everlasting grumbling and natter. Especially in bed, their luck was out. And that's where I'd scold and do them out of their fun. When I felt my husband's arm come over my side, I wouldn't stay another moment in the bed until he ransomed himself to me, and then I'd let him do his foolishness. As always, everything has its price. Who can lure home a hawk when he's empty-handed? To get what I wanted, I put it with all his lust and even pretend an appetite for it. Though I've never had much taste for old bacon. Damn. And that's really what turned me into a scold. For I wouldn't spare them, even at their own table, though the Pope himself sat next to them. I paid them out word for word. So help me God Almighty, were I to make my will and testament here, and now there's never a word I owe them all that isn't paid in full. Come on, we gotta get through this. Also, like, just on a side note, the only part of the reason why I was so tired this morning, I woke up for like, I hate when this happens. But like, you wake up and then like your body just reflexively like stretches in spot. Like while you're still in bed, basically. Your body like stretches itself a little bit. And my leg, I might have like pulled a muscle or something, because I woke up with like the hugest cramp in my leg right now. And it still have it. It's not as bad as it was this morning. Like, I guess I'm still young enough for it to recover relatively quickly. Like, it's not, like, it's still a little bit, like, it aches a little bit, and like if I touch it, then like, yeah, it hurts. But like otherwise, when I'm just sitting here, it's not like bothering me. It wasn't like earlier, like when I got up this morning, it was like hard to walk, because like every step, obviously you're putting like stress on those muscles in your leg, and that obviously hurts. Now it's not that bad though. It's not that bad. Also, like, it's hard to So it's a little hard to focus because like I'm not as well rested as I like to be. Because I woke up in like pain, right? So then you go back to sleep for like a couple of hours, but it's still like not the same. And I couldn't find like, you get home from work and you can't find time to rest after that. So ah. Just trying to find where I was. Oh yeah, right after that whole mega burn. For I wouldn't spare them, even at their own table, though the Pope himself sat next to them. I paid them out word for word, I tell you. And so help me God Almighty, were I were to make my will and testament here and now, there's never a word I'd owe them that isn't paid in full. I managed it so cleverly, they found it best to give up. Otherwise, we never have had any rest. Now he could look like a raging lion, but he wouldn't get his satisfaction. Then I'd say, Darling, look at Wilkin, our sheep, how tame he is. Come to me, sweetheart, let me kiss your cheek. You should be meek and patient too, and have a gentle scrumptious conscience yourself. Since you keep on preaching about Job's patience, be patient always. Practice what you preach. For if you don't, it will certainly teach you how much better it is to have peace in the house. No doubt, one of us must knuckle under, and since a man is more rational than a woman, you ought to be the one to give away. What makes you groan and moan so? Is it just that you want my cunt all for yourself? Why take it all? Have the lot. By St. Peter, how you love it. Were I were to sell my pretty puss, I could go dress as fresh as a rose, and I'll save it just for you. Heaven knows you're to blame. I'm only telling you the truth. Damn, now she's going like full ham here. That's how our arguments used to go. Now I'll speak of my fourth husband. So basically, okay, so before I go into like talk about her fourth husband, her first three husbands are basically like these old ass dudes, and the wife of Bath is pointing out, the whole like, why do old guys marry young girls? Well, obviously for them to put out, but as Bath has kind of given us in funny prose here, she would always find ways of like getting out of it. Because of course, like, it's kind of like, whoa, right? Just, you don't want some guys like old, wrinkly dick, I guess is her way of putting it. That old bacon joke, like, damn, bro, that was rough. Every old guy who's watching this just cringed a bit, I'm sure. But basically, Bath is saying, that's what I'm going to refer to as now. Bath would say, like, I could come up with like 1,000 excuses as to like why I don't have to put out, and that worked out great for me. It's like, yeah, thanks for admitting that you're like you're a total gold digger, aren't you? And you're good at like, you're like a cut above the average gold digger. Like, damn, that's hardcore, and kind of terrible at the same time. But I mean, it is what it is. Okay. Now, my fourth husband was a rake. That's to say, he kept a mistress, and I was young and turbulent, strong, stubborn, and gay as a lark. When I drank a glass of sweet wine, oh, I danced to the lute and sing like a nightingale. That filthy ruffian, Metalius, the pig who beat his wife to death because she drank wine, wouldn't have deterred me from drinking it if I had been his wife. And after wine, I'm driven to think about Venus. For as sure as cold engenders hail, a liquoring tail goes with a licorice mouth. Fill a woman with wine and her defenses are down, as lechers know by experience. But Lord Christ, when it all comes back to me, and I recall my youth and gaiety, it tickles me to the root of my heart. To this day it does my heart good, then in my time I've had my fling. But age, alas, that cankers everything, has stripped me of my beauty and go. Goodbye, then let them go, and the devil go with them. So basically she's saying like, the universal truth, as you get older your looks fade. And it was not easy for the wife of Bath. I mean, she managed to gold dig 3 guys already because of her looks. So now that she's a lot older at this point, and with her 4th husband, it's like, oh, it's not working. This trick, excuse me, this trick won't work anymore, is basically what she's saying. What's left to say? The flower's all gone, and now I must sell the bran as best as I can. Even so I mean to rejoice. And now I will tell you about my 4th husband. I was saying it rankled my heart that he took delight in any other woman. But by God and Saint Jose, he was paid in full. I made him a cross from the same wood. Not sluttishly. It's a weird word, but whatever. Not sluttishly, and not with my body. But I certainly made eyes at other folk till I had him stewing in his own juice with rage and jealousy. By God, I was his purgatory on earth. May his soul be in paradise now. For the Lord knows he sat and bawled often enough when the shoe pinched. No one, only God and he, knew how sorely or in how many ways I tormented him. Now, he died when I came back from Jerusalem, and now lies buried in the chancel underneath the road beam, though his tomb is nothing like the elaborate sepulchre of Darius, so subtly carved by Apelles. It would have been a waste to give him a rich burial. Farewell to him. God rest his soul. He's in his grave now, in his coffin. Now I'll tell you about my 5th husband. I pray God keep his soul from hell. And yet to me he was the worst of the lot, as I can feel on every one of my ribs, and always shall till my dying day. But in bed he was so gay and spirited, and whenever he wanted my pretty puss, how well he knew how to coax. So basically, let's just rewind these a little bit. So the wife of Bath's first 3 husbands, tongue twister there. Her first 3 husbands, they were a bunch of old dudes, and because they were old, they kind of lacked energy and a little bit of the minds kind of going by then. The wife of Bath was able to manipulate these guys pretty easily. The 4th guy was kind of an asshole. He was probably like a middle-aged guy. Probably like the kind of this is such a bad parallel, but kind of like a Charlie Sheen's character, or Charlie in 2.5 Men. Like, even though as he's getting older, he still feels he can have like his fling with women and whatever, and just kind of live nicely, and have his cake and eat it too. So he lives a nice, wealthy life, and because of that, he can go have his flings, and eventually he just died one day. Maybe it caught up to him or something. But I mean, once again, the story leaves that kind of ambiguous how he died. But what the story is saying is that the wife of Bath was very resentful of him, because he was kind of not a good guy. Then she was like, "Sweet, he's dead. Move on. Find new husband. Dig more gold. You know how it be." And so that was kind of the thing with the 4th husband. Now the 5th husband, so far, we're told that he's kind of the wife refers to him as like the worst dude, and it's probably because he was a younger guy that all he wanted was sex, and so she doesn't want to put out all the time, so especially when you've already had 4 other husbands, you don't want to put out, so she had to deal with like a guy who was like very aggressive, and in wanting sex. So that's kind of to get you up to speed. Though he's beaten every bone in my body, he could win back my love in a moment. I think I loved him best because he was sparing of his love to me. We women have, and I'll tell you no lie, a queer fancy in these things. TLDR, the wife of Bath is making that like stereotype of women liking the bad boys. Whatever is not easily to be had, will cry and beg for all day. Forbid us a thing and we want it. Pursue us and we'll run away. We aren't eager to set out all we have to sell. A big crowd at the market makes goods and dearer. If they're priced too cheap, people think them worthless, as every wise woman knows. Now my 5th husband, may God rest his soul, whom I took for love and not for money, was one time an Oxford scholar, and he had left college and taken board and lodging with my best friend, who lived in our town. Oh, God keep her soul. Her name was Alison. As I lived, she knew my heart and secret thoughts far better than our parish priest. I confided everything to her. Did my husband piss against a wall, I told her. Had he done a thing that could have cost him his life, I'd have told her. And another good woman, and my niece also, whom I loved, I have told them every one of his secrets. I did often enough, God knows, and often as it made his face burn red with downright shame when he blamed himself for telling me his most private secrets. So clearly the wife of Bath is not a good woman, right? She's not the kind of girl you would ever want to date. Because she's the person who will she's the kind of woman that every guy fears this moment where if you ever get in a heated debate, and she's the kind of girl who will just emasculate you every other sentence and will say if you were a real man blank, and would just continuously beраil you and just be awful. And so by the time and this is another thing too with the wife of Bath. Now the story doesn't tell us how old she is, because we don't know whether she went from husband to husband and the time in between each guy and whatever. But obviously she's not super young either. So, if I may be so bold and kind of mean about it, she does have a lot of the qualities of the modern feminists today. They're just angry at everything and just talk mad shit. They think they're justified in their shitty behavior. She's one of those. And unfortunately, we've now cultivated a culture of people like the wife of Bath. And it's not good. And it so happens, one Lent, I was always calling on my friend, for I love to have fun and walk abroad in March and April, and May, going from house to house to hear the different gossip. That Jankin the scholar, my friend Dame Alison and myself went into the fields. My husband was in London all that Lent. I had the more leisure to amuse myself, for seeing and being seen by the gay crowd. How could I know where or in what place my luck would turn? So I went to evening festivals and processions, and pilgrimages, and weddings, and these miracle plays, and listened to sermons, dressed in my gay scarlet gowns. Trust me, no moth, worm, or insect had the chance to devour them. And why? They were well used. Now I'll tell about what happened to me. I was saying we were walking in the fields, the scholar and I, and indeed we got on so well that I began to look ahead and spoke to him. I told him that if I were a widow, he should marry me. Indeed. I don't speak out of conceit. You sure about that? I was never without foresight in the matter of marriage, as well as in other things. I wouldn't have given a leak for the metal of a mouse that had only one bolt hole. For if it fails, it's all over. I made him believe he bewitched me. My mother taught me that trick. Also, I said I dreamed of him the whole night long. And in the dream he tried to kill me where I lay. The bed was drenched in blood. Yet I hoped he'd bring me luck, for blood signifies gold, or so I had been taught. And it was all lies. I dreamed nothing of the kind. But in this, as in most other matters, I was as usual following my mother's teachings. By now, sirs, let me see. What was I going to say? Aha! I have it again. I've lost the thread. But now, all the same, when my fourth husband was laid upon his bier, I wept and looked mournful, as wives should. For it's the custom, and I covered my face with my kerchief. But as I was already provided with another mate, I promise you I cried but little. So she's pretty heartless. The next day my husband was carried to the church, followed by the neighbors who came to mourn him. One of them was Jenkins, the scholar. Oh, so help me God, I saw him follow the bier I thought was a fine, clean pair of legs and feet, and I lost my whole heart to him. I should think he was about 20 years old, and I was 40, to tell the truth, but I had the itch for it still. You know, the itch. I was gap-toothed, but it suited me. I carried St. Venus's birthmark. So help me God, I was a gay one. Pretty and rich and young. No, I guess 40's relatively young. And joyous, and truly as my husband's told me, I had the best whatnot that might be. Certainly, Venus influenced all my feelings. Mars, my courage. Venus gave me my desire and lecherousness. Mars, my sturdy boldness. Taurus was in the ascendant, and Mars in it. When I was born, alas, alas, that ever love was sin. I followed my inclinations always, guided by my stars, which made me so that I never could deny my chamber of Venus to any likely lad. Yet on my face I have the mark of Mars, and also in another private place. As sure as God's my salvation, Badung Ching, by the way, with the whole Mars thing. As God is my salvation, I never used discretion in love, but followed my appetite always. Let the man be dark or fair, or tall or short. So long as he pleased me, I took no heed how poor he was, or what his rank might be. It's that whole Russell Peters joke again, where you can tell, like, which girl's a total hoe, when she's like, oh, I don't care what he looks like, as long as he's got a big dick, kind of thing. Yeah, Wife of Bath is one of those. She is not selling herself very well, by the way. I mean, she's surrounded by, like, there's all these guys here in this, like, pilgrim group. Yeah, there's women in the company as well, but the majority is guys, and they all probably think the Wife of Bath is just terrible. Any rational guy, maybe the Miller might find her attractive, but the Miller's also a dumbass. So, so there's that. But, like, you know, it's one of those, like, sick ironies, right? Because a lot of guys might think she's attractive, like the whole MILF thing. But then, of course, like most guys would also find her pretty appalling because, like, there's the whole key in the keyhole thing, and her down there probably looks like sliced up sashimi or something. That was a terrible thing to say. I'm sorry. But you can tell I really dislike the wife of Bath, right? You guys can tell, right? I'm hoping you guys, if I haven't made it obvious. But I also apologize for that really terrible comment. Hashtag terrible pastor. What else is there to say? Well, at the end of the month, this handsome scholar, the debonair Jenkins, had married me with all due ceremony, and I gave him all the lands and rents that had been given me beforetime. But I repented bitterly of it afterwards. He would let me do nothing I wanted. By God, he once gave me such a box of the ear for tearing a page out of his book that I went deaf from the blow. I was stubborn as a lioness, with a real quarrelsome tongue. And walk I would, as I did before, from house to house, though he swore I shouldn't. And because of this, he kept lecturing and telling me old stories from Roman history, of how one Simplicius Gallus left his wife and forsook her forever, only because he saw her look out of the door one day without a hat on. He told me about what's-his-name, another Roman, who also deserted his wife because she went to the midsummer games without his knowing. And then he'd take his Bible and look at the proverb of Ecclesiastes, which absolutely forbids a man to allow his wife to gad about. Then never fear, he'd come with, whoever builds a house of willows, or rides a blind horse over the fallows, or lets his wife run after saints' hallows, really deserves to be hung on a gallows. But it was all for nothing. I didn't give a bean for his proverbs, or his old saw. I wouldn't be reformed by him either. I can't bear a man who tells me my faults, nor, Lord knows, can others besides myself. It made him absolutely mad with rage at me. I wouldn't give way at any point. And now, by St. Thomas, I'll tell you the true story of why I ripped a page out of his book, and made him hit me so hard that I went deaf. Now, he had a book he loved to read, and was always reading it from morning to night. He called it Valorous and Theophrastus, and was always chuckling over this book. There was also a book written against Jovinian by a learned man who lived in Rome, a cardinal called Saint Jerome, and books by Tertullian, Chrysippus, Trotula, and Eloise, who was an abbess not far from Paris. Also the parables of Solomon, and Ovid's Art of Love. These and many another were all bound together in one volume. Must have been a huge-ass book then. Night and day it was his custom, whenever he had leisure or time to spare from other work, to read about wicked women in this book, until he knew more legends and biographies of them than there are good women in the Bible. For make no mistake, it's an impossibility that any scholar should speak good of women, except in the case of the lives of female saints. Certainly not any other sort of woman, as the lion asked the fellow who showed him a picture of a man killing a lion, "Who was the painter? Tell me who. By God, if women had written as many histories as these cloistered scholars, they'd have recorded more wickedness on the part of men than all the sons of Adam could ever put. Scholars are children of Mercury, women of Venus, and two are at cross purposes in all they do. For Mercury loves wisdom and knowledge, Venus revelry and extravagance. In astrology, the exaltation of one is the dejection of the other, owing to their different natures. Thus, when in the sign of Pisces, Mercury, Lord knows, is the dejection, and Venus in exaltation. So basically, for those of you who don't know, they also use the Roman names of like the gods of the ancient world. So Mercury would be Hermes, and Venus is obviously Aphrodite. I say obviously, but I mean that's why in like modern tellings we always refer to like the female as Venus. So when she's saying like this contrast between like Mercury and Venus, which is weird because once again, like the most like the symbol we often associate with men is Mars, and Mars of course would be the Roman version of Aries. But of course there's a weird like the thing about like the Venus Mars parallel is that like there's a close knit to them, which acknowledges like the male and female working together, but also like other darker themes like how sex and violence have a natural correlation. That's the whole story about like Aphrodite and Ares. Sex and violence have like this close association. But using this parallel with like Mercury, now Mercury being Hermes, the god of speed and messenger of the gods. And of course another thing too is that like since the wife of Bath is talking about like her fifth husband who was like a scholar, and scholars obviously would appeal to Hermes often because of course Hermes' role in myth was that he was, as I mentioned before, he's the messenger of the gods, and so he's, I guess, the bringer of knowledge is kind of how people interpret that. He's the bringer of knowledge. As a matter of fact, there's a form of academic study, we call it hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is the science of understanding like text, being able to read a text and to decipher it well and to make good interpretations out of what you read. We call it hermeneutics, and within that word hermeneu is where we get, well, that word comes from Hermes as well. And so the idea is that we're extracting knowledge, just like how Hermes, messenger of the gods, would bring knowledge. That's kind of the idea that's being played at here. And so what the wife of Bath is kind of poking at is, the typical man. Once again, this is not tantamount to how it is today, but this traditional idea of, men being about like rational thought and women being more about emotional impulse. Just thinking about like an old Simpsons episode where the school gets segregated to like boys and girls side, right? And Lisa's in like a math class at the girls' school, and the funniest shit happens, right? So Lisa's like, okay, sorry, not Lisa. Lisa's in class, and the teacher's like starts like playing like weird psychedelic music, and has like all the kind of like one of those like what you kind of thinking like what you kind of see in like those borderlining occult kind of rooms where like it'll have like a light and and then the light will shine through like what do you call those things that like they have cutouts? It's like a little lamp that has like little holes in them, and then as the light goes through the holes, it creates images on the walls, like little light images on the walls. And so the math class that Lisa was in had these little like images, and it was like numbers and math symbols, and then like the teacher's going like all weird. Once again, it's like very, very culty if you think about like, well, I mean, what most feminists don't admit is that they're very, very cult-like. But I mean, to be fair, I mean, I guess it's not a fair thing to like make fun of someone, because by definition everything can be treated like a cult, which is not untrue. But anyway, anyway, so the teacher's like, how does the number 7 make you feel? You know, and the whole like, is the number 3 odd, or is it just different? You know, those kind of things. And then Lisa, she's like, what the heck? So Lisa asks the teacher, when are we gonna do like actual math? You know, like math problems. And the teacher's response is so great, right? She goes, problems. That's what men make out of everything. Problems. Something to be solved. Something to be figured out. And then, of course, that kind of is one of the, like what pushes Lisa to, and then of course like The Simpsons kind of does a whole parody on Othello, or not Othello, Twelfth Night, and as well as like movies that follow that premise, like One of the Guys, and so Lisa dresses up as a boy in that episode so she could go to the boys' school and like do like real math and stuff like that, you know, and do some STEM stuff and whatnot, because of course Lisa is very academic like that. But just that whole part where like the teacher gives that response to Lisa about like, problems. That's what men make out of everything. And that's usually, you know, the approach to like how, of course, to be fair, that critique comes from like how men are way like overly academic in some fields or in some ways of life. And to be fair, you know, like you're on the Streaming Parson channel. If it isn't obvious, you know, like I would contribute to that kind of problem that women would see in men. I'm one of those guys who like, yes, I'm, you know, hermeneutics is. I mean, you're on a channel about a guy who's going through this book and telling you stuff in this book and what it means. That's hermeneutics. Yes, I'm a guy who's like huge on hermeneutics. I have like all those Bible series. Shameless self-promotion. All those Bible series. And me going through like these particular verses and what they mean and other things that the Bible was implying, and you know, all this kind of deep thinking that, you know, a woman like the wife of Bath would be like, oh God, it's one of those kind of guys. Oh God, those guys that think way too much. You know, they're all think, no action. Yeah. There's a reason why that split exists. And I am aware that I'm part of the problem. Because I'm a guy who loves sitting around and thinking. Heck, I was up late last night reading a book. Because I'm a nerd. Like all nerds. Let me rephrase that. Any self-respecting nerd that's honest with himself knows that they spend too many nights just reading. Because we love reading. And then you have women like the wife of Bath who'd be like, oh God, guys who read. But anyway, let's get back to the text, because I think I had a fun little tirade with that and making fun of the wife of Bath's logic and her disdain of men who read. But to be fair, though, in her defense, this scholar guy, her fifth husband, was also abusive. So, you know, she's putting those two things together. But, I mean, those things aren't, you know, there are guys who are like that, right? Your typical, there's a lot, there's a lot of guys that are like that. They'll seem well-read and whatnot, but because of other factors, like, say, being too nerdy and that being an unattractive quality, they tend to be abusive. Of course, that pendulum has swung quite a bit. I mean, the best parallel I can think of is like the typical like male feminist is kind of like that, right? They're supposed to be well read in feminist theory, and then it turns out most of these guys are like abusive to women. How about that? And the wife of Bath is complaining about guys like that, and you know, I know it's like, where's that cancellation, right? I'm surprised I've not been totally canceled yet, but it's kind of ironic, right? And I mean, it's one of those things that like, it doesn't take a lot of brains to figure this out, but despite like how feminists make the claim of like, oh, you know, for women to rise up and be better and to be free from like the male oppressors, what you find out with most feminists is that they're actually they have this like unhealthy attraction to tyrannical men. That's why, like, you know, like, if you went the deep end would be like in politics. It's why women, feminists especially, I shouldn't say women, feminists, because male feminists do this too. But traditional women don't do this. So it's not a woman thing, it's a feminist thing. Anyway, feminists will often vote for politicians that are, like, very openly, like, abusive and very terrible people. They're the ones who support abusive people. And very, like, toxic communities. They're the kind of people who support those things. Because I think part of it is that, like, this is just me thinking now. This is more like a theory that I've just kind of observed patterns. But I think it has to do with, like, where I have to use the Avengers analogy again. But in the first Avengers movie, when Loki shows up in Paris, I think it's Paris or whatever, right? Before he's captured, and there's a part where he appears before all those people, and he's like, kneel. He gets all, and then he, like, yells, and all the people, like, kneel, and then Loki says, "Is this not your natural state? No. To bend in submission to those greater than you." And then, of course, the old guy gets up and he's like, "Well, not to men like you." And then Loki goes, "Please, there's no one like me." And then the old guy goes, "Well, there'll always be men like you." But that whole point Loki makes about how, like, humans desire to be subjugated. And that's also why you find a lot of, like, toxic communities that feminists tend to support tend to be into, like, massive BDSM, which is, like, really messed up. Because, of course, the whole BDSM thing is, like, really messed up when you think of it, like, logically. It's like, the whole idea of BDSM is, like, consensual abuse. So it's not abuse because you consent to it, but then it's like, no, abuse is the actions themselves. Who gives a shit about, like, your quote-unquote motives and your consent level? Abuse is abuse. Because, of course, you run into other problems too, right? You run into, like, justified... And this is where, like, I know, I'm going here hot. I did this, like, last week as well. But I guess because June is coming around the corner, I know it's like... I'm ruining the month of May by thinking too much about the month of June. But as Pride Month comes around, that's why you get more ridiculous advocacies as the years pass and Pride movement moves away from, like, the early sane desires of what the LGBTQ wanted, like, over a decade ago, you know, to not be viewed as a bunch of freaks. But now the Pride movement is all about embracing being as much of a freak as possible. Of course, there's other things behind that too, because the idea is that, like, well, part of what makes the LGBT movement a thing is that it has to do what it can to object to traditionalism. So traditionalism would be like, okay, like, hetero marriage. So do whatever. So basically, the Pride movement has gone more into do as much as you can to fight against that notion, and so that's where you get people, like, as a, you know, think of, like, throughout time, like, for example, like, they've redefined what it means to be, like, gay, for instance. So if you were, like, you know, 20 years ago, a sensible thing would be like, okay, what does it mean to be gay? It's just two men that romantic interest in each other, and, you know, a man wants to marry another man, and then so that's why they fought for, like, the gay marriage thing. So it's like, okay, that's a reasonable request would be, we want gay marriage to be legal so that nobody views us as freaks. Okay, that's a pretty reasonable request. So then it was granted. The government granted that because that was a reasonable request. You know, if they want to get married and not be treated as freaks, they should be allowed that. Okay, that's fair. That's reasonable. But then throughout time, that wasn't good enough, and so it ended up being, like, you know, piss orgies and other dumb shit like that. And then, of course, through stuff like that, like, as for example, like, what does it mean to be gay? It's like, okay, you gotta have, like, lots of crazy gay sex and crazy orgies, and then like there was the whole monkeypox thing and other dumb shit like that. And then as stuff like that kept happening, other things started becoming like more, I wouldn't say normalized, but a lot more like advocated for in stuff like Pride movement. And so BDSM was, so coming back to the point I was getting at, was like BDSM. Now of course BDSM, like, if you just looked at it objectively, you know it's actually really messed up. It's like, the whole, it's just like, okay, so it's consensual abuse. So then you get this weird like backward thinking of like, well, if you accept like, if it's consensual, then it's okay. But then it's like, okay, when does it stop being okay? Where is the, like, of course there's the whole like, well, if it's in a controlled environment and blah 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 blah, and you continuously give consent, blah 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 blah. But once again, once you take a step back and actually see BDSM for what it is, you actually realize it's actually really messed up. Because who would want to, like, one, who would subjugate themselves to being abused like that, and two, how messed up would you have to, like, how messed up would you have to be to put yourself in a position to allow someone to actually like physically abuse you like that, and even sometimes verbally and sexually abuse you like that. And of course the backward logic of like the BDSM crowd is like, well, it's consensual, so it's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay, because in any other context it wouldn't be okay. And so like it's really stupid, right? And of course that's where like the Me Too thing kind of like makes all that implode, because the whole thing about the whole Me Too movement was that it was about where at that time women consented. See, and that word has lost all kinds of meaning as of like late. The word consent almost doesn't mean anything. So women consented to, like, you know, the couch interview. For those of you who know what that is, do not leave a like if you know what that is, you sick freaks. But like, you know, women that consented to like the couch interview, and they did that when they were younger because it was their way of like making, you know, to ensure they could work in like the entertainment industry, like movies and whatever, right? And then years later they say, well, I was actually sexually abused at the, you know, because I was a person with like lower power, because of course there's a whole thing about like, of course men in Hollywood would be abusive. And this is the whole like back to the Ezra Miller controversy thing as well. It's like, of course men in Hollywood are abusive, because they're given the right to be, but then of course that right gets blurred when it becomes advantageous for someone else to exploit that, like, oh, you were an abuser. But at the time, for like people like Ezra Miller to be abusive would have been like, that was the Hollywood expectation. And of course this goes back to the original point I was getting at, is, well, how did someone like Ezra Miller get away with being abusive to women? It's because the fact of the matter is, the feminist thinking is attracted to that. They view that as a virtue, which is really messed up. And so you get a lot of like women in Hollywood who are essentially follow feminist thinking. They get attracted to abuse, to tyrannical guys like that, allow themselves to get abused, and then they of course leverage that because it's a sick kind of power politics game that's being played. And it's no wonder like people are so sick of that crap, right? Like, no wonder. It's no wonder people are so sick of it, and why like your average person is just so sick of like the mainstream media and Hollywood and stuff like that. And it's no wonder. But anyway, I'm like so far away from like the wife of Bath's thing, but basically, I guess if I wanted to tie it back, I would say like the wife of Bath and her like shitty characteristics. I'm trying to make a parallel with her crappy characteristics with the modern feminists, because if you're honest with yourself, they're very, very similar. Now I bring this up is because I thought about something when I was younger and studied this in like school, and I don't know if my teacher knew this in this way at the time, because I mean, for all we know, by the way, my teacher who, I was learning like this book, we were doing this book in school, and the teacher I had at the time, he was like known to be a gay man, but of course this was also like in the early 2000s, so a gay man in the early 2000s is very different from what you might think a gay man today might be like, but really not really, because I also like knew a lot of guys in the gay community in my college years, and some things die, old habits die hard, right? And so of course back in the day, so a little bit of history, I guess, of the gay community back in the 90s. There was a big reason actually that gay men were looked down upon, contrary to popular belief, was not because men were homophobic. It's actually far from that. The reason why a lot of gay men suffered a lot of stigma, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, was not from men. It wasn't actually from men. It was from women. And ironically, feminists that actually really hated on the gay community. Well, primarily the gay men community. Because of course they feminists throw double standard bullshit and wouldn't view lesbians this way. But a lot of gay men, viewed by feminists, they were viewed as like a bunch of raging misogynists. And that the reason why a lot of men were gay was because they were like misogynists. And they couldn't stand, like, after all the shitty women they've dealt with, they themselves became like massive like women haters. That was the popular theory. Of course, not always the case, but I can see why feminists could make that case, and could make a good case about it. I have met some men in the gay community who were like that. As a matter of fact, I learned the worst misogyny jokes from gay men. They told me the worst jokes. I was like, oh shit! I that was pretty bad. And so, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so over time that ended up changing a bit, because of course as the LGBT movement started to gain traction, and of course, I mean, when you put the whole the gay community leveraged that theory that feminists had about a lot of gay men being misogynist. A lot of gay men leveraged that to say like, yes, we are in fact an oppressed group. We're oppressed by women, and so it's a legit argument. So they obviously leveraged that as and then of course like lesbians felt the same way towards like a lot of men. The whole like lesbians being a bunch of man haters. It's not untrue. It's a two-way street. Which then you got to add the B in there, right? Because we're talking about two-way streets now, and so that's how it kind of started. And then of course once again the movement kind of moved away from just like acknowledging the people and their traumatizing experience, and more about being a bunch of freaks. But what ended up happening was that it no longer, see, the inception of like the Pride movement was about like when people were they were victimized, and for people to have a space away from their oppressors. But the LGBT movement, like any other, like really any other like movement that tries to play the victim card for so long, they do what the wife of Bath does, and that is they move away from the quote unquote oppressors in their lives, but then for some sick reason, because I guess they don't heal from their actual trauma, instead they go and do something stupid like reintroduce it back into their lives, which is actually probably why you find that a lot of like you say like feminist groups and whatever, they tend to be attracted to tyrants. That's the nice way of putting it. To people who would be their abusers, they're attracted to them, and then they just like, and then the cycle happens all over again, right? They get abused, they get like victimized, because they put themselves, they surround themselves with people and put people in charge in the political level of people who would abuse them. And that's why you never actually see things get better. Because as people try and fight out of being victims, they then put themselves back into being a victim. And then, of course, like, once again, there's like that weird, sick cycle of like, they willingly put themselves in such a bad position, and they think in the long term they might be good for them because then they can leverage power later. You know, the politics, the power politics play, and they think they can leverage that later. And it kind of goes in like this really sick cycle. Now back to my English lit teacher, who was definitely a gay dude. And I remember him saying that, like, the wife of Bath, he viewed her as like a feminist figure. Which would have been funny because, once again, as I gave that little history of the gay community snippet earlier, he was definitely like he would fall into that whole like semi-misogynist gay man. It is what it is. And so, but he pointed out that the wife of Bath was like a feminist figure. And, you know, I look back on it now, and I wonder, with what I know now, because of course when I was like 16, 17, I didn't think about it as much then. But I wonder, like, I look back on it now, and when he said that, Mr. Mueller, if you're watching this now, you know, be great to reconnect with you, buddy. But, of course, how old would he be? Mr. Mueller would be like 60 by now. No, he's not that much older. He was, what, 40 when I was in high school? So he'd be like, what? Yeah, he'd be almost 60, because I'm in my mid-30s. So, anyway, Mr. Mueller, if you're watching this, I hope I have your interpretation right. But when he viewed the wife of Bath as like a early symbol of feminism, which when you're a 16-year-old high school student like I was then, you might think, oh, is he thinking like a woman who fights for equal rights for women? But when you read as I read the wife of Bath's story, not just now, but as I got older, and then like, and of course you understand the story a lot better of how terrible she is. How terrible a person she is. I wonder if he was thinking about like feminists in the very negative stance like that. It's just something to think about. But and it's interesting to think about it now. And you know, now I'm twice as old as I was when I took that class. But it's just something interesting to think about would be that, you know, viewing the wife of Bath as a feminist figure, to some extent, was actually more like a backhanded comment than an actual, like, compliment. If even or not even a backhanded comment, like a straight out diss. Because, you know, once again, you read through the story and you see that, like, what we've read, so we're only like halfway through the reading. Like I said, the wife of Bath would take a whole stream. There's just so much to talk about with her. But with the wife of Bath, and her being a quote-unquote, like, early, once again, feminism didn't exist in, like, the Middle Ages. But if she were to be, like, similar to, like, a feminist character, and once again, I've already made these parallels, so it's very possible. Because, I mean, once again, even though our modern understanding of feminism is a relatively new idea, in the grand scope of things, I mean, it's not like the Middle Ages didn't have their equivalents, and the wife of Bath would be one of them. But with that said, like, you know, the wife of Bath, similar to modern feminists, and old saying, as much as things change, things stay the same. They're just feminist viewed in the Middle Ages was not viewed as a good thing, apparently, similar to how it is nowadays. Oof, I guess. And Mr. Mueller, I wonder though, were you thinking about this when you said that to a bunch of impressionable teenagers? I wonder. It'd be hilarious if he did. I think that'd be hilarious. But anyway. Where was I? Oh yes. And night and day, It was his custom, whenever he had leisure or the time to spare from other work, to read about wicked women in this book, till he knew more legends and biographies of them than there were good women in the Bible. For make no mistake, it's an impossibility that any scholar should speak good of women, except in the case of the lives of female saints. Certainly not any other sort of woman. As the lion asked the fellow who showed him a picture of a man killing a lion, "Who was the painter? Tell me who." By God, if women had written as many histories of these cloistered scholars, they'd have recorded more wickedness on the part of man than all the sons of Adam could ever put. Scholars are children of Mercury, women of Venus, and the two are at cross purposes in all that they do. For Mercury loves wisdom and knowledge, Venus revelry and extravagance. In astrology, the exaltation of one is the dejection of the other, owing to their different natures. Thus, when in the sign of Pisces, Mercury, Lord knows, is in dejection, and Venus in exaltation. But Venus falls where Mercury is raised. Therefore, a woman is never praised by a scholar, like Mr. Mueller, for when he's senile, and about as much as an old boot at making love, then your scholar sits down and writes drivel about women being unable to keep their marriage vows. But to get back to the point, I was telling you how I was given a beating because of a book. One night, Jankin, my husband, sat reading his book by the fire. First, he read about Eve, whose wickedness brought all mankind to misery, so that Jesus Christ himself, who redeemed us with his heart's blood, was slain. Now here's a text that expressly says women was the perdition of all mankind. Not necessarily what the Bible says. If you've actually watched my Genesis videos or just read the thing yourself, it's much more nuanced than that. But that's an old myth that people like to throw around about, like, how, see, the Genesis story just shows that, like, women are terrible, which is why the Christianity is so patriarchal, blah 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 blah. You know, that old dumb rhetoric. Then he read to me how Samson lost his hair. His sweetheart cut it off with the shears while he slept, and though that betrayal, he lost both his eyes. Also, go watch my Judges video. It's not as one-sided as people think it is, right? Because of course, Samson's sin is that he just didn't obey God and did whatever he wanted, and so that is what made him essentially an idiot. And so it's not Delilah's fault. I mean, Delilah's a pretty bad person, but it's not her fault that Samson was stupid enough to tell her his weakness. He could have just been like, F you, and go do, like, and just leave her. But no, he was too stupid to do that. So really it's more on Samson's fault. But see, most people don't read the Bible properly like that, to read that's what actually happened. They just say, oh, it was Delilah that made Samson fall. It's like, no, Samson was already, like, falling because of how stupid he is. And then, forsooth, he read to me about Hercules and Deianira, who was the cause of his setting himself on fire. He forgot none of the grief and trouble Socrates had with his 2 wives, how Xantippe threw piss over his head. The poor man sat there like a corpse and wiped his head without daring to say more than this: "Before the thunder stops, down comes the rain." And he savored the wickedness of the story of Pasiphae, who was the queen of Crete. For shame, it's too gruesome. Not another word about her horrible delights and desires. And it was with the greatest relish he read of, oh my gosh, Clytemnestra, that's how you say that, Clytemnestra, who treacherously put her husband to death that she might satisfy her lust. And he related to me how Amphiaraus came to lose his life at Thebes. My husband had a tale about his wife, Eriphyle, who for the sake of golden buckle secretly revealed to the Greeks the place where her husband had hidden himself. He got short shrift at Thebes. He told me of Livia and Lucilia, both of whom put their husbands to death, the one for love and the other for hate. Livia poisoned her husband late one evening because she hated him, while the concupiscent Lucilia loved her husband so much that in order he should think only of her, she gave him a so strong an aphrodisiac he was dead before morning. Thus, one way or another, husbands have the worst of it. Next, he told me about how one Laemius grumbled to his friend Arius about a tree that grew in his garden, on which, said he, his 3 wives had hanged themselves out of dudgeon. My dear friend, answered the Arius, give me a cutting from the wonderful tree, and I'll plant it in my own garden. Of wives of latter days, and read how some murdered their own husbands in their beds, and let their lovers have them while the corpse lay stretched all night upon the floor. How some drove nails through their husbands' brains while they slept, and so killed them, while others put poison in their drink. The heart cannot conceive the evil he spoke, and besides, he knew more proverbs than the world has weeds and grass. Better to live with a lion or a hideous dragon than with a woman given to scolding, said he. Better to dwell in the corner of a housetop than with a bawling woman in the house. They are so wicked, and contrary, they always hate what their husbands love, said he. A woman casts off shame when she casts off her schmuck, said he. And furthermore, a fair woman, unless she be chaste also, is like a gold ring in a sow's nose. Who could guess or imagine the pain that was in my heart, or the torment? This is the whole victimization thing, that when a feminist is questioned on why she hates men so much, it always goes back to some dumbass guy. But many guys would say, well, hashtag not all men, and then women say, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's not all men. The damage has been done, and you're not that different from the asshole guy I dealt with anyway. That's usually how most feminists justify. And once again, it's a two-way street, right? Because you'll find guys that dislike women because of the same thing. They'll say, well, this woman was beyond awful, and then the women would go, well, not hashtag not all women, and then the misogynist will say, well, it doesn't matter. The damage had been done. This is kind of idiotic way of thinking that okay, there are clearly bad people, but that doesn't mean that okay, the bad person defines everyone else that shares some kind of commonality with them to be all bad. That's not how the real world is. But people like the wife of Bath, or like your typical feminist, they think in those extremes. She must, just thinking about it now, you gotta feel bad for these pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales, that they have to travel with the wife of Bath. And when I saw he never finished reading that accursed book, but go on all night, suddenly I tore 3 pages out of it, even as he read, and at the same time caught him such a blow on the cheek that with my fist that it tumbled him over backwards into the fire. Then up he jumped like a wild beast and gave me such a punch on the head that I lay dead on the floor. And when he saw how still I lay, he took fright and would have run off if I hadn't come to at last. Oh, have you killed me, you dirty thief, I said. Have you murdered me for my land? Yet before I die, I'll kiss you. Then he came close and kneeled down gently to me, saying, Alison, my dearest, so help me God, I'll never strike you again. You've only yourself to blame for what I did. Forgive me for mercy's sake. But once again I hit him on the cheek and said, You robber, that's on account. I can't speak any more. I'm dying. But alas, after no end of grief and trouble, we made it up between us. He gave over to me the reins. I had the governings of our house and land, and of his tongue and fists as well. and I made him burn his book on the spot. And from that moment, when my winning mastery over him, I got the upper hand. And he said, "My own true wife, do as you please, as long as you live. Look after your honor and my goods." From that day we never had a quarrel. And so help me God, there's not a woman from Denmark to the Indies who could have been kinder to him than I, or more true. And so was he to me. I pray to God who reigns in glory in his dear mercy to bless his soul. And now if you listen, I'll tell my tale. Are you for real? That whole, this was supposedly the prologue of her telling an actual tale. She just, technically telling a story about yourself totally counts as a tale. But no, we gotta deal with more of, the wife of Bath's insufferability. But Chaucer gives us a little bit of a reprieve. The dispute between the friar and the summoner. Now, when he had heard all this, the friar laughed. "Now, madam, as I hope for bliss, that was a long preamble to a tale." But the summoner cut in when he heard the friar sing out, "See here." "God's arms!" cried the summoner. "A friar's always butting in. Look, fellows, these friars are just like flies, always falling into other people's food and getting mixed up with all their concerns." "What do you mean, preambulation?" "What? Amble, trot, or shut up and sit down. You're spoiling our fun like this." So that's what you think, Master Summoner," retorted the friar. "Well, before I go, I'll give you my word. I'll tell a tale or two about a summoner that will set everyone here laughing." "Try it and see, friar, and damn your eyes," said the summoner. "And before I come to Sittingbourne, I'm damned if I don't tell 2 or 3 tales about friars that will leave you lamenting, for I can see you losing your temper." Our host bellowed, "Quiet! Shut up at once! Let the lady tell her story. You're behaving as if you had too much ale to drink." "Go on, madam. Tell your tale. That would be best." "I am quite ready, sir," she said. "Whenever you please, that is, if I have permission from this good friar." "By all means, madam. Tell away, and I'll listen." Now, an hour and 40 minutes later, we begin The Wife of Bath's Tale. Now in the old days of King Arthur, whose renown is celebrated among the Britons, the whole land was filled with troops of fairies. The elf queen and her joyous company danced many a time on many a green field. That was the old belief, I've read. I speak of many 100 years ago. But no one sees the fairies anymore. For nowadays, the prayers and overflowing Christian charity of limiters and other saintly friars, who go about every nook and corner of the country thick as motes in a sunbeam, blessing halls, chambers, kitchens and bedrooms, cities, boroughs, castles, towers, and villages, barns, dairies, and cowsheds, have seen to it that there are no fairies. And where elves used to go, there now walks the limiter himself, morning and afternoon, saying his matins and holy offices as he goes about his district. And nowadays women can wander safely under every bush and tree. The only satyr they'll meet is a limiter, and all he'll do is take their honor. I mean, to be dissed or to go for some grape? You decide which is worse. This is rhetorical. Well, it so happened that in King Arthur's court there was a gay young knight, and one day he was riding home from hawking by the river, when he chanced to see a maiden walking all by herself. Hold up. Running water noise. Okay, the noise is gone. So now we're gonna do that again. Well, it so happened that in King Arthur's court there was a gay young knight, and one day he was riding home from hawking by the river when he chanced to see a maiden walking all by herself, and in spite of all she could do, he took her maidenhood from her by main force. This outrage made a great stir. There was much petitioning of King Arthur, till by due course of law the knight was condemned to death. He would have had his head struck off. Such apparently was the law in those days. Had not the Queen and many other ladies kept importuning the king for mercy, till at last he granted him his life and handed him over to the Queen, so she might decide whether to slay or spare him, just as she pleased. You know what's really whacked about that? So, it's like the whole, like, King Arthur would have done justice to, like, execute a guy for what he did. Because, you know, that, like, we obviously treat that crime as, like, a very serious one and is punishable by death. I mean, the funny thing is that, like, in older, quote-unquote, more backward law systems, like, for instance, like, the Bible treats it as, like, a capital punishment. It's like if a guy does that to a woman, it's to be executed. There's no bullshit. Right? It's like no, you did this seriously heinous thing, you die. But nowadays, like, even like, once again, it's a whole, like, feminists being attracted to tyrants kind of thing, where, like, more tyrannical governments, since they themselves are like that, they tend to promote that kind of bad behavior. The whole, like, sexual predators in Hollywood kind of thing. Instead of, possibly trying to weed that problem out, instead, well, I mean, once again, as I've mentioned before, it's probably due to, like, power politics and being able to leverage it later on, like, a more personal level, i.e., what was her name? The whole Johnny Depp thing. Amber Heard? I think that's her name. I can never remember these people's names. Like, I'm not a person who cares much for these kind of things, because, you know, I'm also in that weird camp, you know, tinfoil hat on, but I mean, Hollywood is entertainment business. It's all a farce. When, like, celebrities bring each other to court over, like, stupid shit that normal people, like people that have money and are very separate from people, and then build drama by doing normal people things. It feels so forced. It doesn't seem real, because it isn't. And so, like, anyway, back to this King Arthur tale that the wife of Bath is telling. It's like, well, if King Arthur was just going to execute the guy for this serious crime, I mean, that seems more reasonable than what's about to happen next. As I will read to you. The Queen gave the King her heartfelt thanks, and a day or two later found opportunity to speak to the knight. "You are still in a very serious position," she said. It's funny how the Queen doesn't have a name. She's not named here anyway. "For your life is not yet safe, but I will grant you your life if you can tell me what it is that women most desire. Take care, take care. Keep your neck bone from your steel. Still, if you cannot give the answer at once, I shall grant you leave to go away for a 12-month and a day to seek and find a satisfactory answer to this question. And before you go, I must have assurance that you will yield yourself up to this court." Sad was the knight, and sorrowfully he sighed. However, he had no other choice. At last he decided to go away and return at the end of the year with whatever answer God might provide him. So he took his leave and set off. He visited every house and all places where he thought he might have the luck to learn what it is that women love most. but in no country could he find two people who agreed with one another on the subject. Some said women love riches best, others said honor, and some said merrymaking, and some said rich attire. Some that it was the pleasures of the bed, and being often widowed and remarried. Some said our hearts are most content when we are indulged and flattered, which I must admit is very near the truth. A man can win us best by flattery, by attentiveness and being made a fuss of. We are all of us ensnared. And some said we love best to be free to do just as we please, and to have no one criticize our faults, but tell us instead we're sensible and not in the least silly. For in all conscience there is not one of us who won't kick when scratched on a sore spot by someone telling the truth. Try it and see. No matter how wicked we may be inside, we always wish to be thought virtuous and wise, which is never good, by the way. Because, you can justify very evil people that way. It doesn't matter if you think being a pedophile is wicked on the inside, to tell them that they're virtuous and wise, because they can reword it as being minor attracted person. See, anyone can play that game. That's why it's not good. Yet others say that we take great delight in being thought discreet, dependable and firm on purpose, incapable of betraying anything we are told. But that idea isn't worth a rake cattle. For heaven's sake, we women can keep nothing hidden. Witness Midas. Who would you like to hear the story? Ovid, among other little matters, says that Midas had 2 asses' ears grow on his head under his long hair. 2 asses' ears growing on his head under his long hair. A blemish which he carefully hid from view as best as he could. Only his wife knew about it, and he loved her above all things and trusted her too, and he begged her to tell no living creature about this disfigurement. Oh no, she swore, not for the whole world would she do such wrong and injury as to sully her husband's name. If only for her own shame's sake, she wouldn't tell. But nonetheless, she thought she'd die if she kept a secret for too long. It seemed to swell so painfully against her heart, she felt she must speak or burst. And since she didn't dare tell it to anyone, she ran to a marsh nearby, her heart on fire till she got there, and laid her mouth against the water like a bittern booming in the mud. Water, don't betray me with your noise, she said. I'm telling it to you and no one else. My husband has 2 long ass's ears. Now it's out. Oh, I feel so much better. I couldn't have held it in much longer, that's for sure. This shows you we cannot keep anything secret. We can hold on for a while, but it must out. If you want to hear the rest of the tale, read Ovid, you'll find it all there. But to get back to the story of the knight, when he saw that he couldn't discover it, what women love most, his heart was heavy in his breast. But he set off home, for he might not stay. The day had come when he must turn homeward. And as he went gloomily upon his way, he happened to ride at the edge of a forest, where he saw 24 ladies and more dancing in a ring. Now eagerly he drew, hoping to learn some wisdom. But presto! Before he had quite reached them, the dancers vanished, he knew not where. Save for an old woman sitting upon the green, he could see no living creature, and she was the ugliest person you could imagine. This old woman got up at the knight's approach and said, Sir Knight, there is no road on from here. Tell me what it is you seek. That may be best. Perhaps we old folk know a great many things. Good mother, the knight replied, the truth is that I am as good as dead unless I can say what it is that women most desire. If you could tell me, I'd reward you well. Put your hand in mine, and pledge me your word that you will do the first thing I ask you, if it lies in your power, she said, and before night I shall tell you what it is. This cannot be good. Agreed, said the knight. I pledge you my word. Then, she said, I dare ever your life is safe, for I'll stake my own that the queen will say as I do. Show me the proudest of them, all wearing her kerchief or jeweled cap, and see if she dares deny what I shall tell you. Now let us set off without more talk. Then she whispered her message in his ear, telling him to cheer up and be no more afraid. When they arrived at the court of knights, announced that according to his promise he had kept this day, and was ready with his answer. Many a noble matron many a maid, and many a widow also, for they have so much wisdom, were there assembled to hear his answer, with the queen herself sitting in the chair of justice, when the knight was bidden to appear. So let's just take a weird quick break, just to talk about the story a little bit, and how weird this story is, especially not just like, as well as say that like, we probably wouldn't pay too much mind to, but especially at the time the story would have been told, you know, the medieval period, would have been kind of really out there. So first of all, this was like a during King Arthur's time kind of story, because of course, you know, in the medieval period they would have told King Arthur's stories, which is actually why when people talk about like King Arthur legends, and there's just so many variations within that, because of course the stuff we have now is just like an amalgamation of tons of stories that people would have told each other during like the medieval period. Because of course, how do I put this? In the medieval times, King Arthur's stories would have been viewed as like somewhat ancient history, but also like recent legend. Now, how does that work? Ancient history and recent legend. So it's the idea of like, they're not sure, like, how do I put this? Because he's ancient history, his existence is long gone. We're talking about King Arthur here. And so no one can confirm, you know, if he's alive or, you know, or not just that he's alive, but whether he existed, because it was been so long since he had lived, quote unquote. But of course, recent legend kind of suggests the idea of like, well, people of the time constantly told stories as if this ancient time was actually recent. I know it's a weird way of putting it. So, a way of trying to create a modern equivalency. Actually, I'll give you two equivalencies. I'll give you a biblical equivalency, and then I'll give you a modern equivalency. So the biblical equivalency that I tend to think of is how the Jews in Jesus' time treated Moses, and the figure of Moses as a figurehead. So Moses was a historical figure in the Jewish world. Moses had lived like a long ass time before Jesus showed up on the scene, because Jesus is 1st century AD. Moses is at earliest. Some people suggest like 1400 BC. I actually go with the younger date, that Moses was probably closer to like 1100 BC. It really doesn't matter. What's more important is the stuff he wrote. You know, the Pentateuch. And so the Pentateuch, which was the center crux piece of, you know, Jewish culture, they would have treated like Moses as the attributor of that. And so, since Moses is the attributor of the Torah, then anytime the religious leaders appealed to the text, they try to put Moses as like the figurehead of the text, instead of just saying, well, the Torah says this, or the law, or the book of Leviticus says this. Instead they would say, well, Moses told us this. And so when they appealed to Moses, who had lived like over 1,000 years before them, but by appealing to him in their present, he becomes a recent legend. So he's ancient history and he's recent legend. And so every time they invoke Moses, that it gives like a weight to something that they're saying, to their claims. Because of course, when they're saying like the law of Moses says this and whatever, and especially in the first century of Israel, you would have noticed this a lot more, because of course by this time there was a lot more like multiculturalism, because the Romans were around, and of course like Greek influences across the known world, because the Romans obviously used Greek as like, this will be the lingua franca, everybody's going to learn this. Because once again, the Romans would have viewed like, well, we're not going to teach everybody Latin, because that's the, we are the elite. The elite speak Latin, And so with that, there was a lot more multiculturalism, and of course, with that comes along like polytheism and whatever. But by appealing to Moses in like the Gospels, when they appeal to Moses, Moses acts as a recent legend, in that even though he lived thousands of years, he has a power over the modern person for the time. And so that's how the ancient history recent legend kind of works. A modern equivalency, this is such a shit example, but I guess you can blame Short Fat Otaku for this one, because I was just watching one of his videos about this. But Adolf Hitler is an ancient history slash recent legend. And so you find this, and man, I'm just shitting on feminists and leftists, as I always do, I guess. But leftists think this way, where they will, like, obviously Adolf Hitler was a historical person, and he did a lot of bad things. And so when people associate people they don't agree with Adolf Hitler, they're appealing to Adolf Hitler as a kind of recent legend, that his legacy of genocide exists in the modern person. And this is where you hear that like nonsensical, like, systemic racism kind of rhetoric, and this kind of recent legend of Adolf Hitler. You find a lot of that in a lot of, okay, let me reword this better. You find a lot of this recent legend stuff using Adolf Hitler in a lot of like critical race theorist people. Critical race theorist, I guess is how you would say it. They kind of treat Adolf Hitler with this kind of same power, which is funny, because that's not the kind of person you want to turn into a recent legend / ancient history person. But that's how it is. So I didn't come up with this. This is just what it is now, and this, you see a lot of this, that people do this. And so any time that like a progressive needs to character assassinate a political opponent, or oftentimes more often it's just someone they just don't agree with, they'll recent legend Adolf Hitler and then attribute that to the person they disagree with. So that's why you hear nonsense about like how, all conservatives are Nazis, kind of like crazy talk. And it's because of the ancient history / recent legend that Adolf Hitler has become, which is really messed up now that's a thing. But that's basically what's happening with King Arthur in this story. He's kind of treated this way in like the medieval Britain social conscience. And of course, the reason why people do this in general, whether it's the Jews with Moses, or medieval Britons and King Arthur, and progressives and Hitler. I know that kind of came out the tongue kind of weird. But, I mean, it rolls off the tongue, but it's also weird that I have to say that out loud. That's what I meant. But anyway, what these things all have in common is that there's this appeal, when you appeal to like history, it gives like a lineage of why you think what you of why you think what you think and what is accepted, right? What is accepted, and stuff like that. And because once again, the modern equivalency is kind of a terrible one, right? But you see it all the time. It's why progressives constantly label their political opponents as Nazis. But where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so the reason why like people do this is so that there's kind of like a weight to their claims, or in the Canterbury Tales case, this story that the wife of Bath is telling. Well, it's a King Arthur story, so it's got to be legit. And so, even though the wife of Bath's tale appeals to the King Arthur in that way, the story immediately subverts that, and all of a sudden the entire court thing is left to like Guinevere, well, the queen, but in King Arthur legend it would be Guinevere. And so it's left to the queen, and then you see like this courtroom is just like, what, maids and widows are now the jury. This would have been something that would completely be unheard of, especially back then. And even in the world today, we don't have like, imagine if it was like, this is such a shit example, it's so terrible, but this is how ridiculous our culture has become, right? It's like if a man was accused of, well, let's just put it like the same case today. If we had a man accused of taking a woman's maidenhood in 2023, and then he was put in a court to be tried for his crime, but the prosecution, woman, female judge, jury, all women. You gotta know something's up, because if we saw that in in our modern court, we would think, hold up, that this no way it's gonna be a fair trial. Let me rephrase that. It does have a guy who's even committed the crime. Let's just say a guy was accused of one. You know, the whole Me Too thing. And I mean, once again, this is where like the modern era has gotten so ridiculous. This is why like, as funny, not funny, funny but not funny stories, that like why like I hang around all these guys that are like in their early 20s, and you know, none of them talk to women. They're all scared. And then what you learn is that they're all scared to do it. Like, none of these guys actually talk to women. They're like super socially awkward. But what I learned is that they're all like afraid to do it, and for good reason, because, you know, if like, and sorry guys, I have to kind of tell it to you like it is. You know, my coworkers, these guys that I work with, are not good-looking guys. They're not. And since they're not good-looking, let's be real. Women can easily take like an unattractive guy talking to them as like a guy being creepy. That's just how it is. And so, and these guys are, let's be real. I know you guys are self-aware. You're not that stupid. You're not aware that you're not good-looking. And it's because of that's why they're scared. Because they know that like, oh shit, if I talk to a girl, she's gonna perceive it as creepy. And if she wants to leverage that, she can easily go to HR and consider it like sexual harassment. And so, let's say like, and then okay, so with that kind of context, imagine if a guy, like a not attractive guy, like one of my coworkers, you know, he wanted to talk to a girl, and she accuses him of sexual harassment, and then he gets brought up to HR, but HR, the HR desk is a woman, and then the CEO of the company is a woman, and then the only witnesses are the female employees that work in the same division, and then yeah, so, and then like not just HR, but like one of the other like higher administrators, all women, that were brought like this case about like my unattractive coworker being accused of sexual harassment because he wanted to talk to one of the girls. And you know, at that point he might as well just like bend over and take it, right? Because he already knows that he's like, there's no way he's getting out of this accusation, you know, without pleading guilty of and just admit that he committed like a serious offense. He might as well just say he did it, right? It's kind of one of those things. And that's kind of what this like scenario in the story kind of paints out. Which, you know, the wife of Bath is a person who favors that kind of like, you know, I just painted out this terrible scenario that could play out for my coworker, hypothetically. But like, man, you know how terrible, like, every guy dreads this. But this is the kind of story that like the wife of Bath is telling, and you can, it's very telling of the kind of person she is as well. Alright, continuing on the story. All were commanded to be silent while the knight told the court what it is that earthly women love the best. The knight, far from standing dumb as an ox, gave his answer at once, and he spoke in ringing tones so that the whole court heard it. My liege lady, he began, in general women wish to have sovereignty over their husbands, as well as their lovers, and to be an authority over them, though I should answer for it with my life. This, I say, is your greatest desire. Do as you please. I am here at your mercy. Not a matron, maid, or widow in the whole court contradicted what he had said. I mean, only a stupid woman would think otherwise, right? All declared he deserved to keep his life. And at that, the old woman the knight had seen sitting on the green jumped up. Mercy, sovereign lady, she cried. See that justice is done to me before your court disperses. For I taught him that answer, for which he pledged me his word to perform the first thing I asked of him, if it lay in his power. And so, sir knight, I pray you before all the court, he said, to take me for your wife. For well you know I have saved you from death. If what I say is false, deny it upon oath. Alas, alas, replied the knight, I know only too well that I made that promise. For the love of God made some other request, take all my goods, but leave me my body. No, indeed, she said. A curse on us both if I do. Old, poor, and ugly as I am, for all the gold and ore that's buried under the earth or lies above it. I wouldn't be anything but your wife and your lover too. My lover, he cried, you mean my damnation. Alas, that ever one of my family should be so vilely misallied. But nothing would avail. In the end, But nothing would avail. For in the end, he was compelled to agree to marry her and take the old woman to his bed. I mean, that's one way to pick up a young guy, I guess. Now, perhaps some of you will say that I don't bother to describe all the preparations and rejoicing that went on at the wedding out of laziness. But to do that, I'll give a short answer. There was no rejoicing and no wedding feast whatsoever. Nothing but grief and gloom. For he married her secretly the next morning, and hid himself like an owl for the rest of the day. He was so miserable at the ugliness of his wife. The knight suffered much anguish of mind when he brought to bed with his wife. He tossed and twisted back and forth, and all the while his aged wife lay there smiling. Then she said, Bless us, dear husband. Does every knight behave like this with his wife? If this is the custom of King Arthur's court, are all his knights so standoffish? I am your wife as well as your sweetheart, she who saved your life. Truly, up to now, I haven't done you a wrong. So why behave to me like this is our first night? Why behave to me like this on our first night? You're like a man out of his wits. What have I done wrong? For God's love, tell me and I'll put it right if I can. Put it right? Exclaimed the knight. Alas, it can never be put right. You're hideous and old, and low-born besides. It's little wonder if I twist and turn. I wish to God my heart would burst. So she said, Is that the reason for your distress? Indeed, and it is no wonder, he replied. Now, sir, she retorted. I know I went back to using a normal voice for her, but there was no way I was going to do that whole old woman voice the whole time. I could set all of this right in less than 3 days if I wanted, so you might as well behave nicely to me. But since you speak of the kind of nobility that's derived from ancient possessions, and think people should be noblemen on that account, that kind of pride's not worth a rap. The man who's always virtuous in public and private, and never strives to perform as many noble acts as he can. Take him for the greatest nobleman. Christ wishes us to claim our nobility from him, not from our fathers on account of their ancestral wealth, for though they may give us all their heritage, for which we claim to be high-born, they can by no manner be of means bequeath to us their virtuous way of life. That alone entitles them to be called noblemen, and bids us follow their example. I'm going to turn the light over because it's starting to get dark outside. Oh, now I'm too bright. No, other light. I'm going to use the other light. Let's change this one a bit. There you go. Okay, let me just find where I lost my spot. Okay. Christ wishes us to claim our nobility from him, not from our fathers on account of their ancestral wealth. For though they may give us all of their heritage, for which we may claim to be high-born, they can no manner of means bequeath us of their virtuous way of life. For that alone entitles them to be called noblemen, and bids us follow their example. On this subject, Dante, the wise Florentine poet, so not the devil slayer, is particularly eloquent. Dante's verses go like this. It's rarely man's excellence rises by the branches because God in his goodness desires us to claim from him nobility. For we can claim nothing from our ancestors except temporal things, which may be hurtful and injurious. And everyone knows as well as I do that if nobility were implanted by nature in any particular family, so that the whole line inherited it, then they would never cease to perform noble deeds in private and in public. They would be incapable of evil doing and vice. Take fire, carry it to the darkest house between here and Mount Caucasus. Then shut the doors and leave it. Yet the fire will burn and blaze as brightly as if 20,000 people were there to watch. That fire, I will stake my life, will continue to perform its natural function until it dies. From this it may easily be seen that nobility is not dependent on possessions, since people do not always conform to pattern, while fire is always fire. For God knows one often enough sees a lord's son behave viciously and shamefully. Whoever wants to be honored for his nobility, because he was born of a noble family with the noble and virtuous ancestors, is not noble, though he be a duke or earl, if he does not himself perform noble deeds or follow the noble example of his dead ancestors. For it's a scoundrel's wrong and vicious actions that make the churl. Nobility is no more than the renown of your ancestors. They want it for their great goodness, which has nothing to do with you. Your nobility comes from God alone. Thus, our true nobility comes by grace. It is by no means aligned to us along with our worldly position. Think of how noble, as Valerius says, was at Tullius Hostilius, who rose from poverty to the highest rank. Read Seneca and Boethius as well. There you will find it explicitly stated that a nobleman is undoubtedly a man who does noble deeds. So therefore, my dear husband, I conclude that although my ancestors might have been humble of humble birth, by Almighty God may grant me the grace to live in virtue, as I hope he will. Only when I begin to eschew evil and live in virtue am I noble. So just a little pause on the old lady's monologue. Which is funny that this is coming from the wife of Bath. Because, like, now we have the good Christian character, which is this old lady that conned a man to marry her. So that's kind of weird how that plays out. But, I mean, the funny ass thing about this is that there's no way you could actually reverse the story. You couldn't gender swap this story, like an older man conning a younger woman and then claim Christian virtue. That would never fly. So it's kind of funny that, like, I don't know how I feel, like, whether we should let this fly here. But of course, as you see the story play out, I mean, obviously this old woman is, like, the good guy in the story. So, I mean, I just gotta take it for what it is. But at the same time, like, because it's the wife of Bath saying it, that's why I have problems. It's not the content itself, it's the person who says it. Before someone calls on bullshit on that, I mean, we do that all the time, right? Like, the person, part of, like, accepting something as being relevant or true or trustworthy, it does depend on the, like, the person, who the person is, right? Because, you know, I made that whole tirade with, like, Snoop Dogg last week about how, like, Snoop Dogg, like, talk about, like, cleaning up Vancouver. Yeah, I'm all for that. But I don't want to hear that from Snoop Dogg because of the kind of person he is. It's the same kind of thing with, like, this story and how, you know, you don't want to hear, like, talk about good Christian virtue from a person like the wife of Bath, who's actually a pretty nasty person. So, but it is what it is. I mean, think about, like, how fast churches fall when, like, you may have a charismatic pastor preach for years, and then as soon as people find out he's abused women, all credibility lost, right? Instead of just taking the content of, like, the gospel itself. It's like, well, and of course, like, that's where some people get the idea of, like, well, they think all religion is fake, because religious leaders can be bad people, because everybody can be bad. Anyone can be a bad person. So, and instead of looking at, like, the content itself, like not through reading scripture and then, like, viewing it as, like, because of course, like, part of it is, like, in human psychology, it's actually impossible to, like, completely divorce a message from, like, the person who gives you that message. It's kind of impossible to do that, and that's fair. But at the same time, the part I do have a problem with is the hypocrisy of people who say, like, well, not gonna bother listening to, like, religious sermons because most pastors, you know, the whole, like, myth of, like, well, I think obviously there's, like, the one or two bad priests that, like, touch kids, but, like, that's obviously, like, a very small number. But as soon as, like, you know, people will not give that generosity to, like, okay, Christian priest, but then, like, you'll find, and mainly progressives are much more guilty of this than, you know, your liberal or even conservative. They'll be quick to, like, defend, like, someone like Karl Marx, right? Like, Karl Marx is a pretty bad person, but then, oh, his ideas are good. It's like, well, you can't be sure about that because you have to evaluate based on who's saying them. And so, Karl Marx is a bit of an extreme. That's not a great example. But, like, try to think of, like, other people who, or, like, other professions too, where it's like, okay, well, the reason why, like, feminist activists are kind of viewed, like, poorly, and why feminism is viewed generally poorly, right? Because a lot of activists are pretty bad people. Well, it's only a small number of them. You know, the bulk of feminists are nice people or whatever. It's like, well, as soon as you appeal the same thing with, like, Catholic priests, the argument's thrown out the window. It's like, well, that's not true about Catholic priests. Well, you know they're all pretty bad. It's like, the hypocrisy behind that kind of logic is just what makes, that's actually the bigger problem, is that like the inconsistency of people accepting that kind of logic. It's like, no, or the rational person would just say, no, you judge people as individuals, and the teaching that they give is the content itself, not who is giving it. So that's the weird thing about like when you read any of these kind of stories. Because once again, we had that last week with the Pardoner, because the Pardoner is a pretty bad guy, but he can tell a very important and wise story. Here we have the wife of Bath, who she herself is a pretty awful person, but the story she tells is actually really good, and the old lady is her mouthpiece of telling a good story. Even though, see, you have to view the old lady as like her own person, and so now the old lady's words are wise, but not the wife of Bath, because the wife of Bath is a terrible person. But even then, like within the story, the old lady is kind of like a con too, right? So it's kind of a little, ambiguous. As for the poverty you reproach me with, the Lord on high, in whom we believe, chose to live a life of voluntary poverty. Surely it's plain to every man, woman, and child, that Jesus, King of heaven, would never have chosen to lead a wicked kind of life. Poverty is honorable when it's cheerfully accepted, as Seneca and other learned men will tell you. Whoever is contented in his poverty, I hold to be rich, though he have no shirt on his back. He who covets is a poor man, because he wants what he cannot get. But he who has nothing and covets nothing is rich, though you may think him no more than a peasant. Juvenal has a happy saying about poverty. When a poor man makes a journey, he can laugh at thieves. I say poverty is a hateful good. It's a good incentive to busy endeavors, and a great promoter of wisdom in those who accept it with patience. Though it may seem hard to bear, poverty is a kind of riches, one which no one will try to take away from you. If a man is humble, poverty generally brings him to a knowledge of God and of himself. Poverty is a spyglass, it seems to me, through which one can see one's true friends. And therefore, sir, since I do not offend you in this, you can no longer reproach me for my poverty. Now next, sir, you reproach me for being old. But indeed, sir, even if there were no authority for it in books, honorable gentlemen like yourself say that people should respect an elder and call him sir. Out of good manners, I could find authorities for this, I imagine. Then you say I am old and ugly, but on the other hand, you have no fear of being made a cuckold. Ha ha! For as I live, dirt and age are the best guardians of chastity. But I know what delights you, and I'll satisfy your grosser appetites. Now that's whacked. I mean, her logic isn't wrong, but that's a really whacked-ass way of saying it. So basically what she's saying is that, well, so what? So, like, you complain that I'm old and ugly, but isn't that a good thing? Because that means I won't cheat on you? Not to mention, since I'm old and ugly and I'm not going to score other guys, so that means I'm willing to put out. That's such a whacked ass, but the way she said it here was just a whacked ass way of saying it. It is a little funny. I will admit that. Like, as much as I hate the wife of Bath's character, I will admit the story itself is funny. I mean, that's the whole thing about, like, storytelling in general. That's half the fun, too, right? Is that, well, the story's good, but it's also coming out of, like, the mouth you don't expect it from. Now choose, said she, choose one of two things. Either to have me old and ugly for the rest of my life, but a faithful, obedient wife, or else to have me young and fair, which who knows how she'd be able to do that, and take your chance with all the men who will resort because of me to your house, or to some other place perhaps. The place is yours, whichever you please. The knight thought it over, sighing heavily, and at last he made his reply. My lady and my love, and my dearest wife, I trust myself to your wise guidance. Do you yourself choose whichever may be the most pleasing and honorable for both of us. I care not which of the two you choose, for whatever pleases you will satisfy me. Then have I gained the mastery over you? Cried she, since I may choose and rule as I wish? Indeed, yes. It's best, I think. Kiss me, she said. We'll not quarrel any more, for upon my honor, to you I shall be both. I mean, I shall be beautiful as well as good. I pray God to send me madness and death if I am not as good and true a wife as to you as there ever was since the world began. And tomorrow morning, if I may not be fair to see as any lady, queen or empress from east to west, then dispose of my life as you please. Lift up the curtain and look. And when the knight saw that it was really so, that she was as young as she was lovely, he caught her up in his arms for joy. His heart was bathed in a bath of bliss. He kissed her 1,000 times in a row, and she obeyed him in everything that could delight or give him pleasure. And thus they lived in perfect joy for the rest of their life. And may Jesus Christ send us husbands who are submissive, and young, and spirited in bed. And may he send us grace and to outlive those we marry. And also I pray Jesus to shorten the days of those who will not be governed by their wives. And as for old bad-tempered, penny-pinching skinflints, God's plague upon them. Oh, that was a long story. Or the whole Wife of Bath thing was pretty long, but I expected as much. But the thing of... So just some comments about this story, I guess, and to finish up the stream as well. So, the Wife of Bath story is like the feminist fever dream, right? It's about like, what is it that women want? And it's obviously to rule over men, which is funny because that's kind of like the modern feminist agenda. It's just to, rule over, well, not just men, but everybody that disagrees with them and be on top. Because of course, in the modern, I know the modern cynical take is that people just, it's all about like power politics and a strive for power and to rule others. And so that answer is just a terrible answer. It's like, what do women want? Is that they want their husbands to be submissive. They want men to be submissive to them. And I mean, that's not wrong in a vacuum, because that's what everybody wants. Everybody desires power, and power is displayed by how you rule it over others. But of course, this is where like time to not be terrible pastor now, but the whole point of like, and of course I know some people will obviously turn this on its head, but it's kind of what it is. It is what it is. Is that like, the typical Christian expression is that like, this is why we submit our own desires to God and to Christ, so that like we don't get consumed by that innate desire. So the human innate desire is to subjugate others. That's just how it is. Because of course, once again, we all strive for power, and a simple way of displaying that power is just ruling over other people. That's why people do what they do. Of course, I know the flip side that some people may say, see, doesn't God do that with people? Doesn't God demand that we submit, kind of thing? And, I mean, I guess there's some legitimacy to that claim. But at the same time, it's like... And of course, this is where like the power politics thing comes in, right? It's like, well, okay, so God is God, being all-powerful, so humans don't have much of a choice anyway. And that's partly true. I wouldn't totally disagree with that. But of course... I guess the two rebuttals to that would be, one, what alternative do you have if you were to be honest with yourself? Because then, back to the whole Loki illustration, we all must bow to someone. We are all meant to. Not only there's a weird like, there's a two-way street. We all want to subjugate others, but yet we also want to be subjugated ourselves. And then of course, to tie it back to even weirder things we talked about on today's stream. That's where the BDSM thing comes in too, right? That's where like the idea, like why people have accepted BDSM as like a form of like sexuality and sexual expression, is because in the grand scheme of things, humans desire both. We desire to subjugate others as well as be subjugated ourselves. And I guess part of like, see, this is the weird thing about marriage in general, is that marriage actually does acknowledge that. It is, but contrary to what people will tell you, and the whole myth of like, it's very one way, because of course that's how some ancient cultures did it anyway, that men did subjugate women. But then of course, the funny thing is that like, in a lot of cultures, marriage was actually like the best thing for women, because it tried to balance out that like that kind of dynamic of like, it's just men who dominate women, but marriage allowed women some control in that dominance, that kind of dominance hierarchy. And so it's a tough thing, because once again, like, anyone who tries to say that they're not, like, they don't have a desire to dominate anyone, you question them, because that ain't normal. But the Christian view is that like, we know that we don't possess the wisdom on how to balance that dynamic that we all have, of we want to dominate others as well as be dominated ourselves, to lord and to serve. We don't know how to balance that. That's kind of one of the bigger problems that humans have, because humans are not known for like doing things in moderation. That's what we are not known for. And so that's something that like, well, God can mold us to be better at both. I know that's a weird way of putting it. That's a very weird approach, but that's kind of how, like, on the one hand, we submit and surrender our more base instincts, which leads to sin, and we lead that we ask God for forgiveness in that we lack that control, and that's what allows sin in our lives. But on the other hand, God allows us to become free people as forgiven. And of course, this is where like the Apostle Paul wrestles that whole, well, yes, we are free, but that's not an excuse to keep sinning. But at the same time, that forgiveness allows you to not be rigid in your faith life. So that's a weird like not contradiction, but it's a very weird, like, they are two very different things, right? Because on the one hand, okay, you're free from sin, but don't keep like overtly sinning. But at the same time, you're allowed to compromise with things and play around with them a little bit, because you're free. You're not stuck to like religious regulations. And so there's that weird balance. And so this is where like the fruits of the Spirit come in. Okay, love, joy, peace. For those things there's no, for love there is no law. And then the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, self-control, and patience, and all those things, right? And so there's this weird like dynamic of how we really balance this innate human nature of like to dominate and to be dominated. And so that's the wife of Vast Tale. Once again, it's like there's wisdom in her tale, but it's her who's saying it, and her character is she's kind of a bad person. So you're kind of like, right? Do I want to take advice from her, kind of thing? But at the same time, the advice is good. You're like, crap, what do I do? But and you're stuck between a rock and a hard place at that point, if you're gonna overthink that. But it's just one of those, like, the interesting thing about the story is that like, when she talks about like the moral of the story is like, the fact of the matter is, if you truly want to see women happy, the way is that men submit. And so Which, funny thing about that is that actually the Bible does teach that to some extent, right? The men love your wives thing. Because, I always made this funny ass, making fun of like when feminists talk shit about the First Corinthians passage about how Paul tells women submit to your husbands, um, for he is the as he has been put master over you kind of thing. And a lot of feminists say, oh, the Bible's so patriarchal, and it's like, oh wait, if you keep reading, then there's this whole charge that Paul gives to men, and if you actually read it, it's like it's actually like a higher call, because then after the whole wives submit to your husbands, as he is the he is your head and lord of the house kind of thing. And then the Bible continues on saying, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, and give your life for her. I'm like, shit, that's a super high calling, right? Like, that's a way higher calling. So in a way, submitting doesn't seem that bad in comparison. And then, like, of course, what the Bible is doing there in First Corinthians is to say that, like, to really turn your marriage into like an actual relationship. And this is where like we get the modern idea of marriages being built on love. It was a very Christian idea, because once again, when I say Christian idea, I mean like it was post like Jesus as well, because even in the Old Testament did not treat marriage this way. It was still very like, as with most ancient cultures, marriage was treated more like business contracts, right? People would get arranged marriage for like political power and stuff like that, and the common people was more like exchange of human resource. I know it's such a shit way of saying it, but that's kind of how it was. It wasn't until basically Christianity became dominant, and even though there were problems with Christianity becoming like the dominant culture, I've been reading a lot of Tom Holland's books, not the actor, the historian, and Tom Holland in his book Dominion talked about how when Christianity became the dominant culture, something with Constantine, it brought in like a lot of really modern ideas, and the world would not exist now as without them. Was basically his thesis, and one of them was marriage, and the way that we changed the idea of marriage. And nowadays we think of like marriage out of love. That was such a foreign idea to the ancient world. It's a bonkers idea, because it doesn't work practically in the ancient world. That was one reason why they probably never bothered to do it. But in Christian thinking, marriage was to be built on something that wasn't just like contractual, but it had to be more on the individual. And that, to that extent, the person's emotions and their feelings. And then from that we get the idea of like marriage out of love. And so that was what the Bible was promoting with the whole wives submit to your husbands, but husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church. And so a big part of that is where, and the typical Christian response would be, yeah, so like even though a man is supposed to be the leader in like his marriage, he still like listens to his wife all the time. He's supposed to be the leader, but he listens to his wife all the time, because he sacrifices his own interests for her. Because of course it's not like, when we talk about like Christ died for the church, I mean, yeah, I would physically give my life for my wife as well. I mean, that of course, but it has to go beyond that. It goes on like on a spiritual level, and part of that spiritual level of loving your wife as Christ loved the church is like you have to sacrifice. You have to quote unquote kill and sacrifice your inner desire. So it's not always about you, kind of thing. And that's we treat that like as a no-brainer thing now, but that's part of like, as Tom Holland's Dominion kind of gets at the idea that like we've lived with this like modern human history has adopted this idea for so long that we treat it like the norm, even though like it wasn't the norm in the ancient world. And it's very counterintuitive to human nature, which ironically is what we see now, because as your typical like traditionalist, your Christian traditionalist, I should say, um, they lament about like how terrible society has gone when we have forgotten God. That's the line they'll use. And one of those things is that um, one of the consequences of um, not honoring God in our modern society is that we revert back to kind of more primitive characteristics. And so things like marriage and relationships out of like love, those ideas are abandoned. And that's where you get like like for instance the celebration of like hookup culture and stuff like that, and the celebration of like degeneracy, going back with like um, pride movement, and why pride will now start advocating for like maps or minor attracted persons, because hey, that was the thing that was totally fine in the ancient world. People having, you know, adults, even old dudes having sex with kids. It was acceptable in the ancient world, and it may make a comeback in the day and age, because we live in a society where we've lost honor for God, and so now we're reverting back to pre-Christendom. And if there's going to be bad things in it, we just kind of accept it if that's what people want. But anyway, back to the whole like submitting to the wives thing. The moral of the story of the wife of Bath's tale is that once again, like from a Christian worldview, there's some merit to that. There is some truth in that, right? Because a man has to live in his life like not think about just himself, and and you know, with that said, let's turn it back again to like the modern problem. The reason why women are frustrated, like your feminists will complain about how stupid men are and frustrated with, you know, the hatred of men. And there's some legitimacy in this when feminists make this claim about how men are so overly selfish. And I know a lot of guys that are like, they're pretty bad. And even guys that mean well, but they're pretty bad, because part of it is that they're not willing to give up things. They're not willing to give up some of their more selfish desires and whatnot. And so, I mean, that's not going to work in a relationship. You can't think you're going to have your cake and eat it too. But there's a lot of guys who think that, and that's why they're still single. So, oof, I guess, right? Once again, this is what happens when you lose respect for God, and we start devolving and moving backwards, and revert to tribalism, that's a bit of an extreme. We're not quite at the tribalism level yet. Only the most insane progressives have gone that far already, but the average group of people haven't gone that far, and we hope we never do. But there is some merit in the whole, like, yeah, husbands submit to their wives, you know, listen to them and not be judgmental of them, and listen to what they say. Although I also would make the caveat is we all have moral imperatives to doubt, so you don't just like submit for the sake of submitting, but rather it has to be thought through. But that way, once again, that's like a two-way street, right? Like, don't just submit to anything, and that's both sides, whether it's the woman or the man. But yeah, that's basically it. I want to point out a couple other things in the story that was like, one thing's really whacked, and the other thing is like a weird like, the wife of Bath kind of did this thing in the story. So the first, like, the thing that's totally whack is that, like, so, you know, within the story when we point out that, like, the night he sees like a grove, and there's like these young women dancing, and then all of a sudden they disappear, and there's like some old lady, and it's in relation to the beginning of the story when it talks about like fairies and elves and the magic world that like King Arthur's world lived in. And then you know that like something's up with this old lady, right? She's obviously not an ordinary human. She's probably a fairy. Which then this is what makes it whack, right? Like, the guy who commits a grievous offense, rape, in the beginning of the story, he's rewarded with like a superhuman girlfriend. Like that's like the anime fever. That's like the anime fever dream, right? To get isekai into another world and have a magical woman fall in love with you. Like that's like the best that thing that could happen. And that happens to like a terrible guy, like this knight in the story. Because remember, he does like a pretty atrocious act in the beginning. He commits the act of rape, and he's rewarded with like the isekai experience of having the hot magical girl fall for him. Like, that's just terrible, isn't it? That's kind of terrible. And the wife of Bath like kind of paints as like a good thing, where like yeah, you know, he gets the rapey knight gets his nymphomatic, super hot fairy girlfriend. Like that is so unfair, and that is just so wrong. If you think, you know, if you think about it, like that's so wrong. But whatever, you know, your typical feminist approach, like the wife of Bath and even your modern feminists, they're okay with rewarding really bad people. So, you know, cancelization of the Streaming Parson incoming, right? The second thing I want to point out in this story, which is kind of interesting, if you guys remember my Gawain and the Green Knight story, and I mentioned in Gawain and the Green Knight, when I read that book, Sir Gawain is another famous story aside from the whole Green Knight story, is the story of Gawain and Ragnar. To my Fire Emblem fans, those names may sound familiar to you. But Gawain and Ragnar was a story about how Gawain met a woman, and she was like an older woman. And then she gave Gawain, Ragnar gave Gawain the proposition that she could either be beautiful during the day and ugly at night when they're alone, or she could be ugly during the day, so bringing him shame in public, but then be beautiful at night for them to have their, you know, rompy fun. And then, of course, Gawain answers, I can't remember exactly how he answers her, but he answers in a way that, like, he gets the best of both worlds. So, like, Ragnar is beautiful all the time. Because Ragnar's a magical woman, too, right? It's also why in Fire Emblem she gets to be, like, a magic sword that doesn't break. So, Ragnar's like a magical woman in the story that she can just change her body like that. She can, and so there's a weird like allusion to the Ragnar story in this story, where the old fairy woman, we'll call her Mirabilis. To my Fire Emblem viewers, hit that like and subscribe because you guys know the reference. So Mirabilis here, you know, she kind of plays that same game with the knight who doesn't have a name. And she basically gives them this whole proposition of like, oh, I could be old. You can either have me like old, ugly, but I'll be a faithful wife, or I could be like super beautiful, but hey, you know, there's a good chance I'll cheat on you because there's gonna be a lot of guys after me, kind of thing. And then he chooses the answer the knight gives is the whole moral of the story. He submits to whatever she wants. And then she goes, well, you pass. You know what women want, and that is to be in control. And so she herself kind of like, she reveals she's beautiful. And then the ironic part is that like right after, he like quote unquote takes control, and then like they have their rompy fun, right? It's kind of like, that's also whack in the story, but I do like the whole little like Ragnar reference in the story with Mirabilis. So it was kind of an interesting way for the story to play out. But anyway, it's enough of me rambling. See, I told you the Wife of Bath story alone would be a long stream. We actually went the whole 3 hours. So thank you for actually like waiting this one out with me for a whole ass 3 hours talking about the Wife of Bath and this crazy tale in the Canterbury Tales. But anyway, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys enjoyed the Canterbury Tales. I'm not sure what we're going to do on Monday. Because see, the weird thing is that like I want to take a little bit of a break until June kind of thing. But it's only like what, the second, we're only like in the first, maybe second week of May. So maybe I'll do something next week. It won't be like a big thing. I'll probably just like screw around, fool around, have a bit of fun. But no projects anytime soon. I don't really have one lined up after I finish Octopath Traveler 2. Cause yeah, we've actually completed Octopath Traveler 2. Definitely check out the playlist if you've missed any of the episodes. It is like 80 hours though, so you're just gonna deal with it because it's Octopath Traveler. It's a long game. But I hope you guys will check out my Octopath Traveler playlist. But as far as next week is concerned, we don't have any official streams planned. Other than like more Canterbury Tales next Friday at 3 o'clock. And of course we have our Throwback Thursday videos that are regular uploads. So once again, next week is kind of like, it's kind of up in the air. But definitely check out Octopath Traveler 2, as I've just completed that game on stream. And I will see you guys next week for sure for Throwback Thursday and more Canterbury Tales. Until then, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. Happy Mother's Day in advance, because Mother's Day is in a couple of days. Happy Mother's Day. And I will see you. I hope you guys have a great weekend. And I'll see you guys next week. God bless you. See you guys later.